You didn't stumble here by accident. And deep down, you know that there's something in you, quiet but persistent, that led you to this very moment. Not because everything in your life makes sense, not because you're certain about where you're headed, but because something within you is stirring, something is shifting, and you've begun to feel it, even if you can't quite name it yet. We often expect healing to arrive like a sunrise, dramatic, brilliant, unmistakable. But most of the time, that's not how it shows up. Healing isn't always a thunderclap. It isn't always a breakthrough that shatters the pain in one clean moment. More often, it starts like a whisper, soft, subtle, almost unnoticeable, emerging in the middle of the noise, the chaos, the mess of being human. It's not the world that shifts first. It's something inside you, something quiet that says, "Wait, I don't need to run from myself anymore." This is the moment where real healing begins. Not when everything is fixed, but when you stop trying to erase the parts of your story that once felt too heavy to carry. Healing begins the moment you stop turning away from yourself. We've been taught to believe healing is about escaping pain, about eliminating the discomfort, about pushing ourselves into light and leaving the dark behind. But that idea only deepens the wound. Because the truth is, healing doesn't come from rejecting your past. It comes from honoring it, fully, unapologetically. Carl Jung said we don't transform by bringing light to the shadow. We transform by making the darkness conscious, and that changes everything. Because suddenly the parts of yourself you've been hiding, the guilt, the fear, the shame, the anger, those aren't flaws to fix. They're signals, parts of you that were exiled, stories that never had a safe place to be told. You don't have to fight them anymore. You just have to listen. What if that tightness in your chest isn't a problem to solve, but a message? What if the part of you that feels broken is actually trying to lead you home? The world may never teach you how to slow down and listen to yourself, but your soul will keep trying. And eventually, if you're still enough, if you're honest enough, you'll feel it. That quiet shift. It doesn't arrive like a parade. It comes in ordinary moments, when you notice you're no longer running from your feelings, when you realize you're not trying to force yourself to be okay, when for the first time you allow yourself to feel without judgment. And maybe you don't even call it healing. Maybe you just call it breathing a little deeper, sleeping a little easier, saying no without guilt, or simply choosing to stay with yourself in moments you would have abandoned before. That is the beginning, the invisible beginning, where you don't need to announce anything to the world. You don't need to fix everything overnight. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. Something is already happening within you, and you know it, even if no one else can see it yet. This kind of healing doesn't need to shout. It doesn't perform. It simply begins, softly, quietly, like roots growing underground. And if you feel something inside you resonating with these words, even if you can't explain why, then that's the sign. You're already in it. You're already healing. Not because your life is perfect, but because you've stopped turning away. And that is where everything starts to change. The first signs of healing aren't always dramatic. They don't come with applause. No one announces it. You might not even notice it right away, but one day something small happens. You pause before reacting. You breathe through a moment that would have once overwhelmed you. You feel the familiar pull of self-criticism, but instead of sinking into it, you notice it and let it pass. That's healing. Not the loud kind. The kind that slips in between moments. The kind that shows up when you're not trying to prove anything. One of the earliest signs is this. You stop fighting with yourself. Not because you've solved every problem, not because your pain has disappeared, but because something in you has softened. You no longer feel the same urge to argue with your feelings. You stop needing every emotion to make sense. You start letting yourself feel, without performing emotional perfection. This isn't about complacency. It's about compassion for yourself, for your process, for the parts of you that are still unraveling. You begin to treat yourself differently. Your inner voice, once so sharp, starts to quiet. You stop using pressure as a motivator. You no longer shame yourself into productivity or punish yourself for needing rest. Instead, there's a new tone in the way you speak to yourself. It's honest, yes, but also kind. You hold space for your sadness. You don't rush it out of the room. You let your fear sit beside you without needing to banish it. There's a tenderness beginning to bloom, a strength that doesn't push, it holds. You used to think healing meant being fixed. Now you're realizing it means being present with all of you. You start to catch the moments when your old patterns arise, and you don't judge them. You simply notice. You become a witness to your own unfolding, instead of a critic. And then something else happens. You stop needing to feel better all the time. You start to see your low days, your quiet days, your uncertain days, not as failures, but as part of the rhythm. You no longer measure your progress by how much you're doing. You begin to honor how deeply you're being. This shift changes your entire relationship with discomfort. You no longer see sadness as a setback. You no longer see doubt as something to fix. You no longer think pain means something is wrong with you. Instead, pain becomes something you sit with, gently, patiently. You let it speak. You let it move through you. And then, when it's ready, you let it go. And here's the surprising part. You may not even feel better, but you do feel clearer. You're less tangled inside, less at war with yourself. That's healing. You begin to make small decisions in your own favor. You start choosing rest without guilt. You start saying no without apologizing. You stop explaining your boundaries. You stop chasing things that hurt just because they feel familiar. Each of these tiny choices becomes a thread, and thread by thread, you begin to weave something new. Trust, not in the world, not in the outcome, but in yourself. You realize that you can be unsure and still steady, that you can feel afraid and still choose to move, that you can feel the weight of sadness and still treat yourself with dignity. And that's one of the clearest signs. Dignity begins to return, quietly. You stop abandoning yourself in moments of pain. You stay, not to fix, not to escape, but to be with yourself fully. You learn to see your tears as cleansing, not embarrassing. You learn to welcome your silence without assuming something's wrong. You learn to trust your own timing, without needing to rush. This new relationship with yourself may not look impressive from the outside, but from the inside, it's a revolution. Because now, instead of constantly pushing or proving, you're beginning to listen. You're not seeking perfection, you're seeking truth. You're seeking coherence between how you feel and how you live. And that kind of inner alignment, no matter how quiet, cannot be faked. So if you've noticed any of this, if your reactions are slower, if your self-talk is softer, if you feel just a little more willing to stay with yourself when things get hard, then something sacred has already begun. And while the world may not see it, you feel it. You are beginning to heal, not because everything is resolved, but because you're no longer rejecting yourself in the process. And that changes everything. There comes a moment in healing when subtle changes are no longer enough. You begin to feel a quiet urgency, not to escape your pain, but to understand it. This is where shadow work begins, not as a trend or a technique, but as a sacred return to the parts of you that were never given permission to exist. The shadow isn't the worst of you. It's the most hidden, the parts of you you were told were unacceptable, the rage you swallowed, the grief you hid, the truth you muted, just to belong. And here's the hardest truth of all. Healing doesn't begin when you rise into the light. It begins when you're willing to sit in the dark with yourself, completely, honestly. Carl Jung said we don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious, because what stays unconscious doesn't disappear. It drives our behavior, our relationships, our patterns quietly, relentlessly. You cannot integrate what you will not face. But the shadow doesn't want to destroy you. It wants to be seen. It wants to be heard. It wants to be held. Every time you denied your anger to keep the peace, every time you silenced your truth to be loved, every time you abandoned your needs to avoid rejection, that pain didn't vanish. It became part of your shadow, and now, as you begin to heal, you feel it rising, not to punish you, but to return home. Your shadow is not the enemy. It's the exiled part of your truth. It's the voice you buried to survive. Shadow work is the process of inviting that voice back to the table. It's looking into the mirror and saying, yes, even that part of me belongs, not to justify your wounds, not to glorify your pain, but to reclaim every part of yourself you once fractured, just to feel safe. Radical acceptance is not passive. It's one of the most courageous things you can do. It's standing face to face with your grief, your jealousy, your fear, your shame, and choosing not to flinch. It's realizing that the emotions you thought made you weak are actually doorways to your strength. That the stories you tried to forget are the roots of your resilience. Acceptance doesn't mean approval. It means acknowledgement. It means you stop pretending that only the polished parts of you deserve love. And when you begin to do that, when you begin to say yes to the parts of yourself you once ran from, something begins to shift at the core. The war inside you starts to quiet. Not because everything is resolved, but because you're no longer rejecting yourself to feel acceptable. You begin to understand that anger, when listened to, is a boundary. That fear, when honored, is protection. That grief, when welcomed, is healing in motion. You begin to see that the shadow is not the source of your suffering. It's the silence around it that hurt the most. And in breaking that silence, you begin to integrate. You begin to return. Shadow work isn't glamorous. It's not linear. It doesn't give you instant peace, but it gives you something more lasting. Wholeness. Because real healing isn't about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before you learned to hide. And that kind of remembering isn't soft. It's sacred. It asks you to face yourself without armor. It asks you to stop performing and start belonging to yourself. So if you feel like you're being pulled into the depths, if old feelings are rising that don't seem to make sense, if you're being asked to sit with emotions that once terrified you, don't run, don't numb, don't override it with positivity. Sit, listen. Let the shadow speak. It won't always be comfortable, but it will be honest. And in that honesty, there is liberation. Because once you see the parts of yourself you thought were unlovable, and love them anyway, you are no longer at war with who you are. That is the beginning of integration. That is the root of true peace. You used to think strength meant holding it all together, pushing through, staying silent, looking unfazed. But now, something inside you is changing, and you're starting to sense it. Real strength feels different. It's not about being invulnerable. It's about being intimate with your vulnerability and still choosing to move forward. You're discovering a new kind of strength, one that doesn't shout, one that doesn't need to prove itself, one that doesn't require you to abandon yourself in order to survive. This strength doesn't show up in the middle of victory. It shows up in the quiet after a breakdown. When you decide to stay present instead of shut down. It shows up when you pause instead of react. When you respond with clarity instead of control. This is emotional intelligence, not the intellectual kind. Not the polished, scripted version that knows all the right words. This is embodied intelligence, the wisdom that comes from sitting with your emotions without drowning in them. You begin to recognize that not every intense feeling is a crisis. Not every trigger is a threat. Not every discomfort needs to be silenced. You've stopped fighting your inner world like it's your enemy. And that changes everything. Because when you stop resisting what you feel, you begin to regulate. And regulation isn't suppression. It's being in relationship with your nervous system, with your body, with your breath, moment by moment. It's noticing your tension before it becomes rage. It's catching your breath before anxiety steals it. It's realizing that you can be overwhelmed and still grounded. That is strength. It's not flashy, it's not dramatic, but it is powerful, because the version of you who used to collapse under emotion, who used to react out of habit, who used to run or lash out or shut down, that version begins to dissolve, not because you hated them, but because you understood them. You finally saw the pain behind the defense, the tenderness behind the wall, and you offered that part of you something it never had before, patience. And in that space, something miraculous happens. You no longer pressure yourself to be calm, you simply become calm. Not because you're suppressing, but because you're rooted. Your center becomes accessible, not just on good days, but especially in chaos. You don't flinch every time life challenges you. You don't leak energy trying to fix or explain every emotion. You don't chase control just to feel safe. Instead, you slow down. You hold space for your fear, your anger, your sadness. Not to be consumed by them, but to stay with them like old friends. You stop identifying with every wave that passes through. You feel it all, but you don't become it all. That's the shift. Now your strength isn't in the walls you built. It's in your capacity to feel deeply without fragmenting. You can cry and still be powerful. You can feel afraid and still make decisions. You can tremble and still take the next step. You've realized strength isn't the absence of struggle. It's the presence of choice within it. You choose not to lash out. You choose not to shut down. You choose to stay. That kind of strength isn't fragile. It doesn't shatter when challenged, because it's not built on control. It's built on connection with yourself. And that connection allows you to navigate life with presence. You speak more intentionally. You don't raise your voice to be heard. You don't absorb other people's chaos just to feel needed. You choose what to carry and what to let go. This doesn't mean you've stopped feeling. It means you've stopped fearing your feelings. You've stopped performing strength and started embodying it. You now understand that holding yourself in a storm doesn't mean you love the chaos. It means you trust your own ability to withstand it, to meet it, to breathe through it, to walk forward, even with a shaking heart. And that is what emotional mastery truly is. It isn't numbness, it isn't perfection, it's presence. And when you live from presence, strength is no longer something you access. It's something you are. As you change, your relationships change. Not because you're trying to make them different, but because you're no longer willing to abandon yourself to maintain them. When you begin healing, truly healing, not just on the surface but at the soul level, you start to see every relationship differently. You start to feel the tension between who you've become and who you used to be in the presence of others. This shift doesn't always feel peaceful at first. It feels like clarity, and clarity can be confronting. You begin to realize how many connections were built on your willingness to dim yourself. How often you said yes when your body whispered no. How many times you tolerated chaos just to feel loved. But now, you no longer mistake proximity for intimacy. You no longer equate being needed with being valued. You no longer seek validation at the cost of your voice. Your boundaries begin to form, not as walls but as clarity. You're not angry. You're just no longer available for relationships that require your self-abandonment. You're not cold. You're just no longer performing emotional labor in places where there is no reciprocity. This is where love becomes something sacred, not something extracted. You don't chase it anymore. You offer it, and only where it's safe to do so, because the kind of love you're interested in now isn't the kind that demands performance. It's the kind that breathes truth, even when it's uncomfortable. It's the kind that honors freedom, not control. It's the kind that mirrors your wholeness, not your wounds. You no longer need someone else to complete you. You've stopped asking others to fill what you've finally learned to hold for yourself. From this space, you stop entering relationships out of need. You enter them from awareness, from fullness, from choice, and your presence becomes different. You don't speak to be heard. You speak to connect. You don't overshare to feel seen. You share what's honest. You don't absorb others' pain as your own. You witness it without losing your center. This is a new kind of relating. You stop fixing people to avoid your own discomfort. You stop shrinking to avoid conflict. You stop confusing sacrifice with love. You begin to realize, if love costs your self-respect, it's not love. If you can't be fully yourself in it, it's not home. And this realization doesn't make you bitter. It makes you discerning. It makes you gentle with yourself. You start leaving spaces that require you to betray your growth. Not with rage, not with drama, but with quiet certainty. Because now you honor your peace more than you chase approval. You know what it feels like to stretch yourself thin just to belong. And now you choose to belong to yourself first. You listen to the quiet discomfort when you override your needs. You hear the voice inside that used to whisper warnings you ignored. You trust it now. You follow it. That voice doesn't lead you into isolation. It leads you into deeper truth. Because here's what you've learned. The quality of your relationships will never exceed the quality of your relationship with yourself. And now that you've chosen yourself, genuinely, fully, your relationships have no choice but to align or dissolve. There's no need to force anything anymore. What is real will remain. What was conditional will fall away. And when it does, you let it go. Not because you didn't care, but because you care about yourself too. From this space, love becomes softer, more honest. You stop playing roles. You stop chasing potential. You stop negotiating your worth. You realize anyone who truly sees you will never require you to disappear. So you meet people where they are, but you no longer stay where you are not met. You offer truth, not performance. You offer presence, not rescue. And that shift, subtle but undeniable, transforms every connection in your life. Eventually, after the storms, after the breaking, after the letting go, you begin to feel something unexpected. Not a rush, not a high, not the kind of excitement that dances at the surface, but something slower, heavier, realer. You begin to feel presence. It's not the kind of presence you force. It's not attention. It's not performance. It's not being hyper-aware of what others see. It's something deeper, something that happens within. At first, you don't even recognize it. It feels unfamiliar, like stillness that doesn't make you anxious, like silence that doesn't feel empty, like breath that comes without effort. This is the body finally starting to trust again. This is the nervous system no longer scanning for danger in every moment. This is the return to a place you forgot you had access to yourself. You begin to realize you're not constantly bracing anymore, not waiting for the next hit, not rushing to fix, control, or predict. There's space inside you now, and in that space, life becomes quieter, but more vivid. Your senses wake up. You start noticing how the wind feels on your skin, how the light shifts through a window, how your own breath moves through your body. Not because you're trying to be mindful, but because your body is no longer in a constant state of defense. You are learning what it means to be here, fully, honestly, without rushing to the next thing. And in a world that celebrates speed and noise, presence becomes a radical act. It is spiritual. It is biological. It is sacred. Because to be here, to actually be here, is to say, I no longer need to escape my life to feel safe. It is to trust that you can meet reality without collapsing, to let each moment rise and fall without grasping, without resisting. And that changes the way you move through the world. You start responding instead of reacting. You speak slower. You pause more. You feel more deeply, but you're less overwhelmed by what you feel. This is nervous system regulation, not as a technique, but as a natural consequence of self-trust. You're no longer hijacked by urgency, no longer fueled by the fear that you're behind. You're not trying to catch up anymore. You're trying to connect. You stop needing everything to be fixed for you to feel okay. You feel okay because you are anchored, not because life is perfect, but because you've stopped abandoning yourself in discomfort. You meet the moment. You stay with it. You allow it to pass through without attaching your worth to it. This is what spiritual grounding feels like. Not floating above the world, but rooting deeply into it. You no longer confuse disconnection with peace. You no longer use detachment as protection. You don't rise above your emotions. You walk beside them. You breathe through anxiety instead of shutting it down. You honor grief instead of rushing past it. You welcome joy without fearing it will disappear. You don't hold on so tightly anymore, because you trust yourself to return, even if you get lost for a moment. And that's what presence truly is. Not being calm all the time, but knowing how to come back to yourself without punishment. It's the safety you've built inside. It's the deep, embodied knowing. I can hold what I feel. That knowing makes you magnetic. People feel it in your energy. Your calm doesn't demand attention, but it invites it. Your steadiness doesn't dominate. It offers safety. You become the kind of presence that doesn't need to explain itself, because it is. And from that place, the world looks different. You stop needing to chase meaning. You start experiencing it. Not because life is less chaotic, but because you are no longer scattered inside of it. You're integrated now, and integration always brings you home. There comes a point in the healing journey where you stop reaching. You stop trying to become something else. You stop chasing the version of yourself that lives in the future, and instead, you begin to inhabit the self you are fully, quietly, without apology. This is integration. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like a breakthrough. It feels like relief, like a soft exhale that's been waiting inside your chest for years. It's the moment you realize you're no longer constantly monitoring yourself, no longer split between who you are and who you think you need to be, no longer adjusting your truth to stay acceptable. You've stopped editing your essence, not out of defiance, but out of love, because now you know who you are, not perfectly, not completely, but clearly enough to stop abandoning yourself. And that clarity has changed everything. You've gathered the pieces. You've welcomed the shadow. You've stopped running from the pain. You've built safety inside your own body. And now something deeper is happening. You're no longer performing wholeness. You are whole, even with your cracks, even with your history, even with emotions that still move through you. You've learned that integration doesn't mean the absence of conflict. It means that when conflict arises, you don't collapse. You stay centered. You stay rooted. You respond from alignment. And this is what makes your presence feel different now. You no longer seek validation to confirm your worth. You no longer need to be understood to feel secure. You don't shrink to fit. You don't inflate to impress. You just are. That kind of authenticity doesn't shout. It doesn't perform. It simply moves through the world with quiet certainty. You don't wear peace like an outfit. You carry it like skin. It's part of you now, and others feel it. They might not know what's changed, but they feel your groundedness. They feel your calm. They feel your boundaries that don't come with resentment, only truth. Your relationships shift, not because you need people less, but because you finally meet them from fullness, not lack. Love becomes cleaner, simpler, not perfect, but honest, not dramatic, but deep. You stop trying to fix others. You stop trying to save what doesn't want to be saved. You simply stay aligned with yourself, and let that alignment decide who remains. There is no bitterness in your letting go anymore, only reverence for the lessons, gratitude for the journey, because you know now even the hard chapters shaped your strength. Even the detours taught you how to return, and that return, that sacred homecoming to yourself, is the real healing. Not erasing your past, not forgetting what hurt, but holding all of it with tenderness, and letting it live inside you without defining you. Your story no longer feels like a weight. It feels like a root system. It grounds you, nourishes you, anchors you. You've stopped carrying your pain like proof of who you are. Now you carry your wisdom. You don't speak from the wound anymore. You speak from the scar. And that scar doesn't make you fragile. It makes you real. It reminds you of what you've walked through, what you've faced, what you've chosen again and again to stay, to feel, to become. And now you no longer live in fragments. Your thoughts, your feelings, your choices, they begin to align. There's coherence in your being. You no longer live at odds with yourself. That internal order radiates. It shapes how you walk, how you speak, how you listen. It makes your silence feel full, not empty. It makes your presence feel steady, not guarded. This is wholeness, not perfection, not certainty, but home. And when you live from that place, you stop searching for the path. You realize you are the path. Everything you've been through, every pain, every pause, every moment you chose not to run, it all led you here. And here is enough, because here you are finally with yourself, fully, honestly, lovingly, and that is the deepest peace of all.